Welcome to this UI webinar. My name is Henrik Kjetan Aspengren. I'm a research fellow with the Asia program at UI, and I will moderate this session. With this webinar, we are highlighting the occasion of the release of a new anthology, the Routledge Handbook of Autocratization in South Asia, published by Routledge and available on open access. The editor, Professor Sten Widmalm from Uppsala University, is one of our speakers today. Sten, I remember you and I had a conversation almost 2 years back, I think, when you mentioned that this book was in the making. You have managed to line up no less than 35 contributors to your anthology. Congratulations on finalizing this project. Well done.
Thank you.
We also have two contributors to the anthology participating. Aisha Kanbalvarish, PhD candidate at the University of Gothenburg, who has written a chapter on clientelism in Pakistan. And we also have Professor Arild Engelsen-Ruud from Oslo University, who will present on strongman leadership under Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. So, as you all know or are well aware, South Asia is home to about 1/5 of the world's population. How this region moves along democracy indices will have a huge effect on whether the world swings towards authoritarianism or democracy. There are several exercises to measure the condition of liberal democracy worldwide. One of the most influential is the Varieties of Democracy project at Gothenburg University, VDEM for short. And in your chapter, Sten, you're including VDEM concepts and data, and you will be explaining your approach in more detail shortly. I will, for now, only provide a sort of rudimentary definition. So, autocratization is a term used in the research literature to describe a process in which an episode of democratization is being significantly reversed. For the case of South Asia, this means, according to you, Sten, and other contributors, that the wave of democracy, which started in the early 1990s, is currently heading in the sort of opposite direction. This you suggest despite the fact, for example, that the two most recent national elections in India showed bigger voter turnout generally and among women especially than ever before. But participation in elections is only one out of many indicators you work with. But you also say that the situation is not binary. A country which is experiencing an episode of autocratization is not per definition an autocracy. Trends of autocratization are complex and they can change. Before I hand over to you, Sten, to explain your argument a bit further, let me also present an alternative perspective to which we could perhaps return later. Political leaders in South Asia have objected quite forcefully to the findings of, for example, VDEM. So Mr. Jaishankar, India's external affairs minister, said, according to the Indian Express, and I quote him here, "You use the dichotomy of democracy and autocracy. Do you want a truthful answer? It's hypocrisy, because you have a set of self-appointed custodians of the world who find it very difficult to stomach that somebody in India is not looking for their approval. So they invent their rules, their parameters, they pass their judgments, and then make out as though this is some kind of global exercise." And you can see similar sentiment expressed in many speeches by, for example, Prime Minister Modi in the Indian Parliament or in front of the General Assembly at the UN. That democracy does not only have one source and one crowned expression, which is liberal democracy. Democracy has many sources, of which the Indic civilization is one. Now, you might not subscribe to this idea, and you might find this to be sort of a slippery slope towards relativism or nativism, but the idea has purchase, not least among constituencies in South Asia. So I hope we can engage in the discussion about this as well. So without further ado, Sten, if you could give your presentation. And before I hand over to you, actually, I should also mention that for the audience, you're free to put your questions in the Q&A function, and we will pick them up towards the end of this hour. Thank you. Sten, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here, and I'm glad that I got this invitation from Utrikespolitiska Institutet to make this presentation. This means a lot to me and all the co-authors for the book, so we are greatly appreciating this. And I want to start by saying that I am one of the so-called self-appointed custodians, because I am one of the persons who's a country expert on India. I'm not self-appointed though. I was asked by a research team, an international research team, to provide information on a yearly basis on democratic performance in India. But we use a lot of information here from the Varieties of Democracy project. So that is in the chapters that I have written. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll show the trends here. And what I will do now is to share. Let's see how this works out. Yes, Henrik, this is coming up. Yeah, good. I'm very glad. Okay, so this is the book. And you can see here that, as Henrik mentioned here, we have quite a number of contributors here. I will not say all the names or call out the names of the chapters, but I will help you to guide to the book, guide you to the books here. We have one first part of an introduction, and then we have a part on India, one on Pakistan, one on Bangladesh, and we have one on Sri Lanka, and final part on how to comprehend the broad developments that we are seeing. So if you go to the Routledge website, you can see that this book here costs quite a lot of money, but you can get all the content available via open access. And we are greatly indebted to the Kungliga Vetenskapssamhället i Uppsala for this, because they have financed the largest part of the open access fees here. So we also got a lot of help from Routledge to do this as well, because I don't think it has been done so many times before. So thanks to Routledge for this as well. So open access, just click on the links and then you get the book for free. So I'll just say a few words very quickly. I'll speak very quickly about regime development, and this is to give space in the end also, so you can ask questions and I can answer them, hopefully. We'll see. There are things going on here and in South Asia, which I will talk about. I'll just show you the trends for Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. This is the Freedom of Expression Index. And you can see a marked trend downwards from like around 2012, 2014, a downward slope for India. Rapidly, it's going down. Here you have the freedom of academic and cultural expression. These measurements are built up by many variables in the Varieties of Democracy database. Here you can see that Sri Lanka is making a rapid downturn more recently, for example. You can see the civil society organization repression is turning the situation terrible for civil society in all countries in South Asia. And so what is the pattern? What are the patterns like here of autocratization? Well, we see certain things here which come up in a variety of ways in these countries mentioned. And it seems that when a pattern of autocratization is taking place, civil society is targeted first. Then follows freedom of expression, media freedom, and then we can see how this is followed up by changes to the constitution, which usually in several cases here are turning the countries into ethnic states. To use, for example, the term used by Christoph Jafferlo and others in the book as well. Political parties, on the other hand, they are to a large extent left alone, because this is a signum for the hybrid democracies, that you can leave the facade in place. You can have news agencies, you can have you can have books being published, etc. Things look okay from the surface. You can have courts running, you can have the police force running, things like that. But these crucial parts of democracy are undermined from within. And this is just continuing, unfortunately, in this part of the world. I show you the development over time here for these 4 countries from independence to up until last year. And here you can see that Sri Lanka and India were performing about the same way, in a similar way up until the early 1970s. And then there was a downward turn for Sri Lanka, and one really dramatic one for India as well. But then you can see that India bounced back, it recovered, there was resilience in India. So India managed to come back in this first major downturn. And then India performed quite well here, and you can probably see the effects of Panchayati Raj reforms here, things like that. And things were not improving so much from here onwards. And you could see the Congress party during the second term was not performing well at all. So there is a slight downward slope here, but the real downward slope starts in 2014 when the BJP government comes into power. And then the decline is much more and dramatically rapid downwards. If you take a broad perspective on the developments here, if you look at the Electoral Democracy Index in the world and Asia, you can see the world mean here. This one is here, the world mean. And you have the South Asia mean being this one here. It doesn't look too bad. There's no dramatic change, it looks like. The conditions here are not so dramatic as you may think. But if you look at this one here, you can see there is a downturn here. And you may say, well, as Sherry Bierman shows in her work, democracy means going up and down, right? Yes, but however, though, look at this. If you divide the world into democratizing countries and autocratizing countries, you can look to the left one first, the left part of this figure. And here you just have the number of countries which are democratizing, right, in this part of the graph here, and then the ones who are autocratizing here. And you see that the number of autocratizing countries are going up here more recently, and democratizing countries are going down. But if you weigh this in relationship to the population, the graph looks like this. If you look at the part of, if you take all the individuals living in this part of the world, then you have this catastrophic increase in the number of people living in autocratizing countries. And to explain this, we have to pay attention to India. In India, there has been a dramatic change in politics over the recent times, and we can see how the BJP, most political scientists thought that BJP in this graph here was going to be on par or a little bit below the Congress party for a long time, up until 2009. Then there is a great change. The support for the BJP rapidly increases. So here is the map with Congress party in blue, how it looked like, what it looked like in 1984 after the election. And here you have the graph for 2019 with the BJP being represented here in saffron colors. So it is quite a dramatic change. How do we explain India? Well, this is the short explanation. India, you have the BJP, which is a hungry party. It's a party filled with people who are angry, who feel that they've been stepped on and that they haven't had their rights listened to and things like that. They're highly motivated and well organized. But the other side, the other part of the explanation is the fact that Congress has not stopped to function as the main second party here. But it has serious problems. It's complacent, disorganized, and it relies on dynastic rule. And at the same time, also, the country is changing. The youth is using different kinds of media to be informed and to be mobilized, and the Congress Party is not being able to follow this. The BJP is much better at mobilizing the youth. And of course, finally, also, this is a part of the world ongoing trend. This is the share of the world population living in autocracies. In 2010, it was 48%. Today, it is 68%. Today in the world, only 13% of the population in the world today have the kind of media freedom that we experience here or in Norway or in the United States. And at the global scale, we have big changes. The Asian century has begun. So all the production of goods and services in Asia is now larger than the rest of the world. And this has a huge impact because, of course, China, which is an authoritarian state aiming at or turning into a totalitarian state. And it's opening up its roads towards the west, towards the east, via the new Silk Roads and the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, you may, as a final point here, you may see this, is this a clash of civilization we're seeing here? You could think that easily, but there are things that speaks against this. Because there is variation in patterns we see. We must not forget this. India has been the main gravitational force making such a large part of the population in that part of the world, in South Asia, and in the whole world. India has been responsible for lifting the majority, 75% of the population in South Asia above into the sort of democratic realm, okay? So when India goes below the democracy level, however we define it, well, then everyone suffers, like the majority of the people in South Asia suffers. If Huntington was right with the civilization hypothesis, what we are seeing here, well, that would make China-Pakistan cooperation impossible, because China and Pakistan are cooperating, even though China have concentration camps for Muslims. India and China are not. They should have Pakistan as their common enemy, according to the civilization, clash of civilization hypothesis, but they don't. And there are more conflicts within than between civilizations in this region. You can observe that. And when you express this, even though Huntington is eerily correct when he predicts that India is becoming an ethnic state in 1992 already, well, if you say that there is a clash of civilization, well, that watch will be correct twice a day at least. So this is the very, very, very quick summary of the beginning of the book and the end of the book. And then the book is absolutely full with interesting country examples. And that's what we will listen to now, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sten, for that comprehensive introduction to the anthology and some of the concepts and trends that we are seeing. Could I just follow up on before I hand over to Aisha, one of the things that you mentioned in the beginning? So you say that democracy is in retreat in several parts of the world, and you mentioned some aspects where South Asia stand out. But there are also commonalities with other parts of the world. If you could just briefly remind us, what are the sort of commonalities between what is happening in South Asia and elsewhere, if we look at perhaps Central Europe and other parts of the world where you see this happening? And now you're muted.
Thank you. Well, I think that one of the commonalities will be brought up by both Aisha and Ari, because we will hear about clientelism and we will hear about big men kind of concepts that are important here, how the emphasis is moving towards leaders and their networks rather than ideologies. That's perhaps one of the biggest shifts that we are seeing. It is very hard to orient yourself today in politics with a left-right scale only. And that's something that will come up here in the two following presentations, I think.
Great, thank you. So we can segue over to you, Aisha, and you will take us into the world of clientelism in Pakistan.
Yes. Thank you very much, Sten, for that. And thank you very much, Henrik, also for having invited me today. So now that Stan's given us an overview of the region and the macro trends that are occurring in the democratic backsliding in South Asia, I'd like to hone in on the micro level, where we look at the operative mechanisms of democracy. Specifically, I want to turn to individual political behavior. And the relationship that I'm looking at, as many of you in the audience probably are familiar with clientelism, and I would like to, for the people who may not be, just briefly give a definition that a lot of the voting behavior, voters across the developing context are normally seen as vote sellers. The vote buying literature known as clientelism and vote buying is, in the contemporary political science literature, you see or understand voters as selling their votes to the highest bidder for a material exchange. So it's a hierarchical relationship, but what I look at is what I term religious clientelism, where the exchange is not centered on a material incentive for the voter. Instead, it's non-material, supernatural goods that voters are getting from their patrons. Here, the patrons are the peers, what I term peer politicians. They've been researched heavily and have existed in Pakistan specifically and across the Muslim world for centuries. And murids in this relationship are lower in hierarchy in the religious realm. Both actors actually operate in two realms, both in the religious and in the political at the same time. So they have dual roles. What brought me actually and interested me in this entire project was what motivates these clients to vote for these people if they're not actually getting anything. And it fascinates me also. I understand why a peer would become a politician. They just want to consolidate their power. But what's happening in the nitty-gritty on the ground? So the chapter where I explicate on this focuses on three functional aspects of the relationship itself and how, in today's context of Pakistan, it can actually reinforce the autocratic trends that Sten was talking about in the region overall. So before I go into the specifics there, I would like to also mention that it's not just voting behavior. Many of us, when we think of Pakistan, we think of Islam, religion, the foundation of Pakistan. Why was it founded? A Muslim state for the Muslims of India. Then if we fast forward, we've had the war on terrorism, we've had Al-Qaeda, but then, curiously, no religious party has ever formed government in Pakistan. And this brings us to the point that Sten mentioned. Programmatic politics, as we see in the Western context, is not necessarily how politics play out in South Asia. Over there, religion matters, identity matters, there are networks. You can have your biradari networks in Pakistan, you can have in India as well, similar. You have your caste networks. So all of this is when I say religious clientelism, we're bringing in I don't want to call it identity. I want to rather call it a religio-political bond, because it operates on two levels for these followers, the murids. It's both a personal belief system, but it's also a social identity that they carry with them. And from my field work, what starts getting clearer is that there's a continuous negotiation in the mind of the murids about what is stronger. Is it this religious relationship? Is it the social identity? So that now brings me to the three functional aspects that I talk about in the chapter. I talk about murids viewing voting as a religious duty, first of all. The second one is the inability to change one's peer. And third is social sanctioning. So I should give a brief outline of the peer-murid relationship. A murid takes on a peer by swearing allegiance to them. Normally, this is supposed to be of free will, etc., but in practice, it's through tradition, and you will follow whoever your family has been following, and when you come of age, you go swear allegiance to the peer. The peers that exist, examples in today's Pakistan is the foreign minister in Pakistan, Shah Mahmood Qureshi. The former prime minister, Sayyid Yusuf Raza Gilani, is another example. In fact, 16% of Pakistan's National Assembly are peer politicians. And this trend has not been decreasing from the 70s all the way till today. 16% is only National Assembly, and this is a conservative estimate, mind you, of the coding that I've done. I've used certain terms like Sayyid, Maktoum, and Pir, but this leaves out all the Pir politicians that choose not to use their honorifics in their electoral registration forms. So the number can be higher. And if I was speaking to one of my colleagues the other day who asked me, as a political scientist, Aisha, aren't you supposed to come up with solutions? How do we get rid of them? And my answer to her was that it's not as easy. If what democracy is, it's this balance. It's a delicate balance, like when we get to see the rainbow. A lot of things have to happen. Pakistan loves to tout that, oh, we have free and fair elections. Look at the European observation team. They said that the past elections, 3 elections have been free and fair. Yes, but civil liberties also matter. Civil society. And now when I say civil society, I'm not just keeping to what we academics look at as civil society organizations. I'm also referring to the involvement of the common man, of the population in a country's politics, which is important. All of this has to mesh and massage together for a democracy to remain strong. And if anyone thinks that, oh, wait a minute, haven't leaders been aware? Yes, leaders have been aware of peer politicians and their infiltration, if I shall put it that way. Ali Bhutto knew about it, Zia knew about it, General Zia, Ayub Khan, and all of these leaders, and even Musharraf, they tried to hone in on it and tried to use it to their advantage, but miserably failed. And yeah, I think the relationship per se, I wouldn't want to class Murids as undemocratic people. I think it's more a relationship that can go either way. And I mentioned this in the conclusion as well, that the way Pakistan's going right now, if we go down to the tribal mentalities and we don't actually choose politicians in order for what is the best outcome for me. Like one of my interviewees speaks about, I'll vote for my peer politician over the person who even delivers because it's my religious duty and this person will give me salvation in the end versus my cousin maybe. So there's a lot of ranking going on there. I think I'm going to end it right there, and I'd rather take up questions, and I'll leave it over to Arild.
Thank you. I'll jump in between, Aisha. Thank you so much for that presentation and taking us down to the sort of nitty-gritty. Can I follow up with a question to you just straight away before heading over to Arild?
Yes, please.
So, if I understand correctly, this peer-murid relationship, the saint-devotee relationship, exists both during episodes of democratization and episodes of autocratization. Is it manifested differently in these different types of developments or processes? Or is it the same kind of relationship, but it just plays out?
It's the same kind of relationship that just plays out differently depending on what the trends are going like. For example, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, when I interviewed him and his son, the answers I got, the elite interviews, I mentioned the names, but not the Murids. Over there, they act aloof, but when you get into the discussion with them and ask them, and they say, of course they vote for us. So they're very much aware of the power that they hold over them, which is why one idea has been, as a policy recommendation, to follow like Ghana, where chiefs are not allowed to run for office, tribal chiefs. But then you have the problem of someone like Pir Pagada in Sindh. He himself is not running, but he is influencing the voting behavior anyhow by directing who he wants them to vote for. And the Murids are sent out lists of, these are the people we want you to vote for, unless you know the party affiliation that your peer leans towards. So yeah, it all depends on how the trends are going. They can be used either way. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. We might come back to that. in the discussion afterwards. But we'll now move into Bangladesh, and Ariel, please.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Henrik, for the invitation, and thanks, Sten, for putting this volume together. It's fantastically interesting to see such a volume and all these interesting articles, chapters in it. It's also interesting because I think that one thing that easily gets overlooked in Sten's otherwise brilliant introduction, of course, is that there are actually quite substantial differences between some of these countries. And I'd like to just emphasize that when I talk about strongman leaders, which I think is a useful concept to have in mind in this context, because it's about building these autocracies rather than just seeing them there and identifying them. It's about the building process. And I think that there are actually quite strong differences in terms of how these autocracies are being built and how far down the line they've come. First, for Bangladesh, it's clearly more autocratic than India at the moment. Just to mention, I mean, it's further down on the indexes. It's much more of an one-party state. Election commission is under the thumb of the president, who is under the thumb of the prime minister. You have enforced disappearances. You have extrajudicial killings, etc. It's much more of a dire state than India is. Secondly, one could also argue, I suppose, that Bangladesh was never really much of a democracy. I mean, you did have changes of government, and the incumbent would invariably lose in a few elections in the 90s and early 2000s. But the relationship between different political leaders and the parties was toxic, as it's been described as a toxic democracy and a terrible and quite violent political culture, much more so than in India. Right. So the question is, where does Bangladesh come from when it's building this autocracy, and how does that happen? And I think that's really interesting because so I've taken my clue in this context from Juan Lintz, who in his book Breakdowns of Democracy, democratic practice, lets us trail our focus to the question of political elites. And this book, so How Democracies Die, by Levitsky and Ziblatt, which is based on years and years of excellent research on autocracies and authoritarian government, does the same thing. They help us trail the focus to elites. And I think that's interesting because it's, according to Ziblatt and Levitsky, it's how elites collaborate or do not collaborate, how they accept or do not accept formal or informal institutions. That really is at the core of the question of how countries that used to be democratic, or at least to some extent democratic, become less so. I think that in the case of Bangladesh, you can see quite clearly a few trends and of how this happened over the last 15 years. It's quite clear evidence of elite members joining hands or making enemies of one another, undermining institutions over the last 15 years. But it happens, I argue, under the leadership of one person, and it's quite remarkable that this one person is Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. It's someone you have to admire. She is an extremely extremely powerful personality and an extremely clever politician. I think that her whole idea has been that she wants to transform Bangladesh, and in order to transform Bangladesh, you need to have power and you need to retain power. And that's what she's been doing, and that's the recipe she's been sticking with. She's done that, I think, in 3 different ways. And that's the article, the chapter that I have in Sten's volume, what it's about. So the first thing about Sheikh Hasina, she's of course the daughter of Mujibur Rahman, who is the father of the nation, Bangabandhu. And Bangabandhu, her father, was killed by army officers. He was prime minister of the country for a mere 4 years, and then he was killed by army officers, very disgruntled, quite mad, a ludicrous coup, very bloody, unnecessary. In 1975, her whole family was killed at the same time, except her and her sister. Her 3 brothers, one quite young, was killed. Her mother, her father, uncles, cousins, etc., all killed. Very bloody thing in 1975. That's one thing, part of her history. Another thing is that in 2007 and 8, the country was run by the military. The military pursued something they called -2 formula, and they tried to get her out of the country. So she had a reason to be angry with the military. However, what she does when she becomes prime minister again in 2009 is that she successfully builds bridges to the military. She does that there are several different contexts in which she does this, but she does build bridges to the military. She also builds bridges to the bureaucracy, which is somewhat more of a conservative force than her own army league. And you can see this today, that army officers and civil service officers, they have tremendous perks as part of their office, right? As part of their job. As part of their job, they have a car, chauffeur-driven car, right? But they also get private money to buy a private car from the government. And they get maintenance money for the car. And they get all sorts of opportunities while they are in office and after retirement if they behave. So there's an enormous kind of clientelist, to use another, clientelist relationship being built between the government and civil service and army officers. So that's one way in which she's been doing this. Another way in which she's been building her position is to build it quite consciously around who she is. And she is her father's daughter. She is the daughter of the father of the nation. And there's a whole story about sacrifice in that story. A tremendous story of blood sacrifice. His death is commemorated annually in mourning day, August 15. There's also Bangabandhu's, her father's homecoming day, his speeches, etc., etc. So there is, I think, arguably an entire cult around her father that helps build her position. It also involves other members of her family, such as her brothers who were killed. And their names appear, or images appear on institutions, on money, notes, stamps, naming, etc., 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 including sports clubs, etc. So there's this building of a cult that also sustains her. And she makes a point out of this being the very close witness to Bangabandhu, which makes her the ideal person to carry through his dream for Bangladesh. So the third point that she's been doing, the third thing that she's been doing, is that she's changed constitutions quite considerably. And this is something that you find has not been done so much in India. The constitution has been changed, considerably. The main thing is that the caretaker government instrument that she was part of instituting in 96 was abolished. This was a neutral overseer of elections. It meant that she lost in 2001, but she also learned from the fact that the opposition tried to manipulate the caretaker government instrument twice. So she just abolished it. That means that she can, or the government that she is heading can manipulate elections, and they've done so successfully. So you've had 2 elections quite recently under her rule in 2014 and again in 18, who that were sort of completely without an opposition. And of course, there is legal changes, new laws that they've been using, including the Digital Security Act, that makes almost any criticism of the government illegal. There was a case, just a figure came up, I think last year, in March last year. It said that, let me see if I can find it. I thought I wrote it down somewhere, but I didn't. The most of the people who are accused under the Digital Security Act are not journalists. They're ordinary citizens, which means that for most of Bangladesh, this law is such that it creates a sense of fear and apprehension that any criticism of any individual, and in particular of any politician, can put you in jail. It's a non-bailable offense, and it can put you in jail for 3 years. And even if you don't go to jail, you have the lengthy trial. So it's pretty bad. I think that, okay, just to wrap up, because my time is running out, Sheikh Hasina has been a clever politician because she's built a coalition, an alliance of very important forces in society: the military, the army, the police, and the bureaucracy. And actually, interestingly for Sten and Aisha and those of us speaking here, in Bangladesh, the civil service includes the academics, so they have fantastic perks. We might actually want to move there. They are much better off than we are. Now, the problem with this kind of a setup is that it very much depends on Sheikh Hasina herself. So you have all sorts of succession issues. You have all sorts, and she cannot be everywhere. There are cracks visible in this edifice. Army versus police, for instance, and also the lack of party law, discipline are issues that will plague the situation in Bangladesh for years to come. And so Henrik's initial point, drawing from Sten's introduction, that there will be, the trends can change, is very much the case of Bangladesh as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariel. I'll just remind the audience that you can send in your questions through the Q&A function. We have a couple of questions already, and I will go into them just after my initial question to you, Ariel. I think that the link you made between, well, you mentioned that Sheikh Hasina has this vision of transforming Bangladesh, and for doing that she needs power. Because I was thinking about this, because when you read on the sort of economic development and social indices of Bangladesh, it seems to go in the right direction in so many ways. Sustained growth over a long period, significant reduction in poverty, investments in education, and especially for girls. So that opposite direction for politics and social and economic indicators, is that easy to, I mean, how do we square that?
No, you're absolutely right. There is actually it's a very interesting contrast, because the development in terms of economy in Bangladesh is going quite well. But it's a bit like the Chinese model, isn't it? That you can have economic growth without democracy. And I think I have my guilty pleasure in much of this is that I have a secret admiration for Sheikh Hasina, because I think that she's been doing, you can look over the years, all the quite clever and quite courageous steps that she's taken that have been successful. I think that she really wants to build a prosperous Bangladesh, but she's unwilling or unable, probably unwilling, to relinquish any power. And she saw that twice happening in the 90s, in 96 and 2006, that if you give the opposition the little finger, they will take the whole hand, as the saying goes. And she cannot risk that.
Great. Thank you so much for that insight. So we have, I'll now turn to the questions from the audience. And this is, the first question is for anyone, I would say, in the panel. Whoever wants to reply first could start off. So the question is, could you share any insights about the potential correlation between democratic autocratic practices and periods of climate change related natural disasters or disruptions? For example, did the 2014 floods in India and Pakistan have an appreciable impact on governance or civil society in either country? So that's the first question, and I put it out to any of you to reply to. Sten, perhaps you go first.
Well, I think that short answer is that natural disasters of various types can play into regime change in, this is the boring answer, in a variety of ways. We have seen how earthquakes have brought the populations together, and how borders have been taken down and people have donated blood across ethnic groups, etc., in ways which are just profoundly impressive. At the same time, for example, with the COVID crisis, you can see that many of the authoritarian leaders are using the COVID crisis as an excuse for imposing stricter anti-democratic laws and policies. So it can really go different ways. And I like, it's interesting what you said also, Ariel, about that you can have economic development, but without democracy. Yes, the school of modernization has some real problems here, but what's happening particularly in Bangladesh is that it is that the kind of economic development we see in Bangladesh also is from the chapters in this book showing this, that they have there is no criticism towards the Hasina government because she's doing everything right in so many ways when it comes to the economy. But besides the fact that people are suffering from less freedom, you can see that the environmental costs are huge in Bangladesh as well. This is not sustainable, what's happening in Bangladesh right now. Thank you.
Thanks. And Ariel, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah. It's a very good question, very interesting one. And I agree with Sten that the costs are tremendous. Delhi, Dhaka, etc. are, the most polluted places on this planet, for instance. I mean, that's just one aspect of this. But I do think that the edifice that's been built, in particular in Bangladesh, the ruling edifice, is so strong that natural disasters are not going to impact it to any considerable extent, partly because they are able to silence any criticism of what they are doing or not doing, such as during the COVID crisis, ongoing crisis. There's been relatively little criticism of the government in Bangladesh for not doing enough, although, of course, there could have been a massive criticism, because there's always something that they're not doing right, and there's always there's more than enough suggestion that they haven't done enough. They could have done much more. It could have been handled much better. I don't think it was as disastrous as it was in India, but it was still pretty bad. However, even if that criticism had come out, I mean, you did see it come out in India. didn't impact the popularity of Modi. There's a lot of these things that don't really impact the popularity of the government. There are exceptions. They're not about nature or climate. You have, for instance, how the economy is going down the drain in Sri Lanka, which is impacting the popularity of the president. However, Bangladesh is doing pretty well in terms of economy. So the whole crisis caused by COVID is not impacting people quite the same way. So they're scot-free.
Thank you. We have two more questions from the audience here, and so do you have something to add to what we were discussing, Aisha, about Pakistan, or can we move into the other questions?
No, we move on, please.
All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just want to add very quickly that actually the one thing which has impacted the most so far on the leadership in India has been the farmers' movement. And that is not unrelated to climate change, but they have been the strongest political opposition force in India in relationship to the BJP government over the last couple of years. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So thank you. I'll ask Arild another question from the audience here. And so we'll keep in mind that we have a couple of more questions that we can bring in. So the question for you then is, how can elites in Bangladesh be able to maintain power and dominance over politics and state? So if there's a short answer to that.
How can elites be able to maintain power?
maintain
power and dominance over politics and state? That is the question.
Okay, so I think that there's actually, I mean, the elite in, so there's one thing, right, there's several things. But one of the interesting things about how elite operates in Bangladesh is that if you belong to the opposition, as long as you don't make yourself too, quarrelsome, if you don't make too much of a hassle, too much of a bother to the government, you're left alone. And of course, all politicians in Bangladesh, and probably in India and Pakistan as well, are businessmen because they have to. As someone said, to be in politics, you have to do business. To do business, you have to be in politics, right? So they all, but their businesses are left alone if they don't create too much of a problem. And those who are targeted are only those who make too much of a problem. So there's one thing. So how does one change the situation currently going towards autocratization, towards more democracy? I think that one of the important things would be to make sure for the elites that if you lose the election, you would not lose your businesses. You're not going to lose your life. You don't have to go into exile, which has happened very often, right? So that sort of security, the safety of your family, of your businesses, etc., would be important for you to accept a loss. Now the situation for Army League is such that any loss of power would mean exile. And that's a very heavy price to pay for someone else's fancy of democracy. So you don't.
Thank you. We have one question for you, Aisha, from Sten. And so you will take that, and then I would like to finally conclude with one question from the audience.
Sure.
Great. Yes, I was thinking, Aisha, that we see all this variation within the countries, and we also have these global trends, which South Asia is a part of as well. But when it comes to Pakistan, how would you assess the impact of the withdrawal of American and other troops from Afghanistan and the impact of the Taliban regime there, when it comes to Pakistan's way of adapting to changes there, also being under the influence of China? How is this impacting on regime type development, things that we're looking at when we discuss autocratization or democratization?
So locally in Pakistan, China is a welcome breath of fresh air versus America, because the United States has, for over 2 decades almost, steered so much of the direction the country was taking. And as far as the public was concerned, if you read the dailies, the Dawn, the Chang newspapers, you realize that people are upset about we're giving so much to America and they do nothing. But China is great because China is investing in the local economy. It's building all these bridges, the infrastructure. But what a lot of people don't read the fine print, that China has gotten a 99-year lease on the Gwadar port, where the government has, I don't know how willingly, given up the income that they're going to earn from this to China. 99 years, a developing country. And I mean, the only anger that people are very happy with Imran Khan, that, you know, he got out the Americans and the drone attacks have reduced because he was very vocal about this. But inflation is what's causing anger in the public towards Imran Khan right now. So I think overall the China Belt Initiative is very popular because people see results. And, you know, big infrastructure projects always in developing countries end up having these amazing the outward, like even the metro projects that happen in Islamabad and in Lahore, that's what made Nawaz Sharif popular, right? So that way, China is definitely the new king in town, and you also see it when you go visit. You see a lot of Chinese citizens walking around. After the security scares and COVID, it's diminished, but when I've been in there in 2019, you walk into a mall, seeing Chinese citizens is not strange, and they don't speak any Urdu or anything. So there's also this new, I think the middle class is concerned about being seen as inferior to Chinese people in local discussions, etc. But I don't think it's a general trend. But a question I have for both Arild and for Sten.
But first, Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. I don't think Afghanistan is very happy with the American removal, because Pakistan is now seen as, it's a dog-eat-dog policy. Pakistan has never been seen favorably by Afghanistan or by Afghanis in Afghanistan. They see Pakistan as very fickle. They'll go wherever the money is coming from. But then again, geopolitical interests and foreign policy interests are, you know, everyone's not buddy-buddy. Pakistan looks out for what it thinks is its biggest advantage. And frankly, their advantage is in maintaining the Taliban and the Tayyib al-Lashkar, and the army has implicit funding, which, you know, obviously is never out in the open.
So we will need to wrap up in a few minutes. So one last question that we have got had from the audience here is about the US, Russia, and China, sort of the pull effect that we have. You have been touching on it a bit, but you have a separate chapter in the book on China's pull in the region. Very briefly, does it affect the region that we have an autocratic state neighboring with a lot of money coming in and presenting another type of development model? Very briefly, yes, no.
China can be seen as a gravitational black hole in the region, I think, when it comes to regime type development.
Aisha, you have mentioned it.
I have a quick thing to say. Having studied China on the side, China, like India, moved a lot of people from poverty above poverty line. China is probably the nation that has taken the most people out of poverty. So if we look at from quality of government perspective, something I wanted to touch on what Arild was talking about, in China, the trust for the police is extremely high. And that is a quality of government outcome that not many people expect from an autocracy. But I don't know what it looks like in Bangladesh, for example. Is the trust for the police force high from the common man?
We have 30 seconds, Arild, so...
No, it's extremely low. It's just like India. No one trusts the police. Police is corrupt, etc. China is extremely important in Bangladesh, partly because it's the largest source of arms, of weaponry, but also because it provides a beautiful counterweight to India. India is tremendously influential, but then you can go to China and you do as the Chinese, and the Chinese don't care about all these, autocracy, complaints, etc. Democracy. They don't care about that, so that's fine. So the Chinese, with their money, fantastically important.
So with those words, I want to thank the panelists for their insights and contributions, and also for making this book open access. It's a great opportunity to read it. And I want to say thank you so much to the audience for listening in, and for your questions. We couldn't follow up on every question you had, but thank you so much for your contributions. And also thank you to the team at UI for making this happen. Thank you, and stay tuned for more seminars and webinars as we move ahead in 2022. Thank you.